Every school rule from the 2000s that makes no sense now. 1. No hats indoors policy. You felt the brim of your baseball cap and the principal's stare. This rule originated from 1950s etiquette manuals, not safety concerns. Over 80% of American schools enforced it in 2005. It cost districts thousands in detention monitoring hours annually. You sat through third period with sweat dripping down your neck. The policy assumed headwear signaled gang affiliation statistically. Studies later showed zero correlation between hats and violence. You learned compliance mattered more than logic. It was your first lesson in arbitrary institutional power. But headwear restrictions were just the beginning of bodily control. 2. Zero tolerance for pocket knives. You brought a Swiss Army knife for woodshop class in 2003. Zero tolerance policies mandated automatic suspension for any blade. The 1994 Gun-Free Schools Act was misapplied to pocket tools. Over 12,000 students were expelled for non-violent infractions by 2006. You watched your friend miss finals over a letter opener. Legal challenges cost districts an average of $50,000 per case. The policy disproportionately targeted rural students who carried tools. You learned that context meant nothing to bureaucracy. It was the first time you saw punishment divorced from intent, but physical tools were nothing compared to digital restrictions. 3. No cell phones during school hours. You hid your Motorola Razr under the desk in 2004. Schools banned phones before most adults even owned them. The first mass phone confiscation occurred in 2002 in New York. Districts stored over 5,000 seized devices annually in locked cages. You paid a $25 fine to retrieve your own property. The policy assumed all communication was cheating or disruption. Parents couldn't reach children during actual emergencies. You felt the weight of the brick-like device in your backpack. It taught you that connectivity was a privilege, not a right. But analog restrictions couldn't prepare you for internet censorship. 4. Computer lab login protocols. You heard the clatter of beige keyboards in 2001. Each student had a unique ID and password for 30-minute sessions. The network could only handle 15 simultaneous logins per classroom. Forgetting your password meant a 45-minute wait for IT reset. You watched the hourglass cursor spin while your presentation deadline loomed. Schools spent over $10,000 annually on Novell NetWare licenses. The system crashed if more than 2 users accessed the internet. You learned patience watching 15-kilobyte images load line by line. It was your first encounter with artificial scarcity in the digital age, but restricted internet access was nothing compared to content filtering. 5. Mandated website blocking. The Children's Internet Protection Act passed in 2000. Schools received federal funding only if they installed filtering software. Over 90% of districts blocked educational sites by mistake. You couldn't access breast cancer research because the filter flagged breast. Teachers submitted override requests that took 3 business days to process. The software cost districts an average of $5 per student annually. It created a generation that believed the internet was inherently dangerous. You felt the frustration of a blocked page with no appeal process. It was censorship disguised as protection. But digital walls were nothing compared to physical movement restrictions. 6. Hall pass hierarchy. You held the wooden plaque with the school mascot in 2005. Some schools required 3 different passes for bathroom, water, and office. The pass system originated in 19th century Prussian education models. Students spent an average of 12 minutes per day waiting for pass approval. You felt the eyes of 30 classmates as you walked the empty hall. Administrators tracked pass usage to identify problem students statistically. The policy assumed all unsupervised movement was suspicious. You learned that your bodily autonomy was conditional. It was surveillance training for a monitored future. If your brain is already short-circuiting from this institutional nostalgia, there's a full timeline map with policy documents in the description, but movement control was nothing compared to expression suppression. 7. Dress code gender specificity. Female students faced 47% more dress code violations in 2007. Policies banned distracting clothing that supposedly disrupted male learning. Girls were sent home over strap widths measured in millimeters. Districts spent thousands on substitute teachers to cover classes during dress code checks. You felt felt the humiliation of being labeled a distraction at age 14. The policy reinforced gender binaries before most students understood them. Legal challenges argued it violated Title IX protections. You learned that your body was a problem to be managed. It was your first encounter with institutionalized sexism. But clothing restrictions were nothing compared to thought policing. 8. Zero tolerance for disruptive speech. You wrote a poem about sadness in English class in 2006. Schools expanded zero tolerance to include threatening language after Columbine. Over 300 students were suspended for creative writing assignments. The policy defined disruption as anything that made staff uncomfortable. You watched a classmate expelled for a horror story featuring fictional violence. Legal precedents like Tinker versus Des Moines were ignored in practice. It created a chilling effect on student expression nationwide. You learned to self-censor before you even understood why. It was the birth of performative compliance in your personality. But speech control was nothing compared to mandatory conformity rituals. 9. Mandatory Pledge of Allegiance. You stood with your hand over your heart at 8:05 a.m. daily. The 2002 Supreme Court case Elk Grove versus Newdow upheld school mandates. Over 95% of districts required participation despite constitutional challenges. Students who refused faced detention, isolation, or parental calls. You felt the social pressure of 30 pairs of eyes on your stillness. The policy conflated patriotism with compliance in young minds. It violated the very freedom of speech it claimed to celebrate. You learned that dissent was more costly than silent participation. It was your first lesson in the performance of belief. But ideological conformity was nothing compared to physical standardization. 10. Standardized testing, seating arrangements. You sat in alternating rows with empty desks between you in 2008. No Child Left Behind mandated specific proctoring protocols nationwide. Schools spent over $2 billion annually on test security measures. Students couldn't use the bathroom during 4-hour testing windows. You felt the panic of a blurred question with no clarification allowed. The policy assumed all collaboration was cheating. All questions were equal. It reduced complex learning to bubble sheet metrics. You learned that your worth was a number between 1 and 4. It was the industrialization of childhood assessment. But academic standardization was nothing compared to behavioral modification. 11. Detention for minor infractions. You sat in Silent Room 204 after school in 2003. Detention policies originated in 19th century penal education models. Over 60% of schools used detention for tardiness under 5 minutes. Students lost an average of 40 instructional hours per year to punitive detention. You completed busy work that had no educational value whatsoever. The policy assumed punishment inherently improved behavior without evidence. It disproportionately targeted students with transportation or family challenges. You learned that time was a currency schools could confiscate. It was your first encounter with the school-to-prison pipeline. But punitive time loss was nothing compared to permanent record consequences. 12. Permanent record threats. You heard the phrase, "This goes on your permanent record," in 2001. Most schools didn't actually maintain records beyond 7 years post-graduation. The myth persisted because it was an effective behavioral control tool. Over 80% of adults believed the threat was real in 2010 surveys. You modified your behavior for decades based on a fictional consequence. The policy leveraged childhood fear of future unknowns for present compliance. It taught distrust of institutional transparency from an early age. You felt the weight of invisible judgment on every minor choice. It was gaslighting, disguised as guidance. But psychological manipulation was nothing compared to physical safety theater. 13. Lockdown drill procedures. You crouched in a darkened corner away from the door in 2005. Schools began active shooter drills after the 1999 Columbine massacre. By 2009, over 90% of districts conducted unannounced lockdowns. Students weren't told if drills were real or practice until after completion. You felt the primal fear of helplessness during simulated emergencies. The policy assumed trauma inoculation prepared children for violence. Mental health professionals warned of increased anxiety and PTSD symptoms. You learned that safety was performative, not guaranteed. It was the normalization of existential threat in childhood, but institutional fear was nothing compared to the final rule. 14. No PDA policies. You passed a folded note in 2004. Heart-pounding. Schools banned public displays of affection, with vague, unenforceable definitions. Policies often prohibited holding hands, hugging, or sitting together. Over 70% of violations resulted in same-gender students being targeted. You felt the confusion of having natural affection pathologized. The policy conflated adolescent development with disruption statistically. It reinforced heteronormative assumptions while punishing all intimacy. You learned that your body's natural impulses were inappropriate. It was the medicalization of normal human connection. But emotional suppression was nothing compared to the ultimate institutional contradiction. 15. Think of your future. Threats. You heard this phrase before every minor consequence in 2009. The rhetoric originated from 1980s accountability movement talking points. Studies showed fear-based motivation decreased long-term academic engagement by 30%. Teachers used future threats for present compliance without evidence of effectiveness. You felt the weight of decades of potential failure on a single choice. The policy assumed children understood abstract future consequences developmentally. It created anxiety disorders in students who internalized the pressure. You learned that your present self was only valuable for future utility. It was the ultimate extraction of childhood for institutional metrics. The bell rang. You survived. Did they?